I am going live. Good evening and welcome everyone to our first Extending Empathy talk of the academic year. My name is Dr. Nathan Carpenter. I'm in the School of Communication where I serve as the Director of Convergent Media. And I will be serving as technical director and partial moderator for this evening. And I'm going to pass it off now to, actually before I pass it off, I'll just explain some of the overview of what will be happening. If you have questions or comments, I would ask that you put them in the chat. If you have difficulty writing or responding and would like to raise your hand, we do have the ability for you to do that as well. I'll be looking for anyone that does want to pose a question at the end of the talk, either in the chat or if you do have a hand raised. We're also casting directly to YouTube tonight for those that are not at ISU and part of a larger audience. And for those of you who are watching on YouTube, there is an approximate 10-second delay. And so do feel free to pose questions in the comments and we will get to them as soon as we can as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to, I believe I have, Scott, actually. I'm going to turn it over to Scott, who will talk a little bit about this project.
Thank you, Dr. Carpenter. On behalf of the faculty, students, and staff of the Department of Psychology at Illinois State University, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the Extending Empathy Project on the road to Tulsa. The project actually started in 2018 when I sent out a call to department faculty about a growing concern, the lack of empathy we're experiencing in our culture. Many faculty responded, and in that first year, we were able to sponsor 10 colloquia. It was very important to us that our students witness this work and witness us doing this work, particularly in the midst of the rhetoric of fall of 18. Then, due to the pandemic, we were only able to bring 4 colloquia to fruition during the academic year. However, when we discovered certain things happening in Tulsa on June 20th last summer, the gentleman I was working with on an HBO Watchmen Twitter project, that would be Dr. Carpenter, Dr. Hunt, and Dr. Craig, decided that we needed to create some alternative programming for that evening for the nation. So we were thrilled that our very own Dr. Byron Craig and Dr. Stephen Rako gave a talk entitled, "What Should Empathy Be in This Moment of Historical Reckoning? Reconciling Black Trauma, Whiteness, and the Historical Structure of Racism Since 1619. This talk was a huge success, followed by a discussion section that's still available today on the School of Communications Facebook page. And immediately after this meeting, the 4 of us knew we had to create a series, the Extending Empathy Project on the road to Tulsa. Now, this series is made of 8 colloquia, tonight being the first one, and the final talk will be given June 1st, 2021, again by Drs. Craig and Dr. Royko. And the June 1st colloquium will be given in commemoration of the Tulsa Massacre of 1921. Now, it's our hope that over the course of this series, we can collectively come to understand an approach to empathy that does not shy away from the hard, important choices we need to make in this country about wealth and equity and opportunity. And as we launch this series in celebration of Black History Month, we hope that you will join us in all 8 colloquia, join the conversation, spread the word, and help us extend a grounded, resource-informed approach to empathy to a larger and larger group. And now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Byron Craig from the School of Communication here at Illinois State University.
Actually, we're going to turn it over to Dr. Hunt first.
That is exactly what we're going to do.
That works. It's all good. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us. The School of Communication is extremely proud to partner with the Department of Psychology on the Extending Empathy Project. And Dr. Jordan did an absolutely awesome job of explaining the goals and the mission of this project. Dr. Carpenter, who you met at the top of this, is the school's director of convergent media, and he deserves our gratitude for all the technical support, as well as the other work that he's doing with the project. So Dr. Carpenter, thank you. Dr. Craig, who you're going to be hearing more from here shortly, Dr. Jordan, Dr. Carpenter, and I are also exploring opportunities to take this project to nationally through the National American Democracy Project, and we hope to be doing some of that work more next year. So opportunities for expanding that. And in that vein, we're thankful to Felice Noodleman, who is the executive director of the National American Democracy Project, has just been very supportive of this work. In addition, our own Dean, Diane Zosky, has been very supportive in getting the word out about the work that's happening here, and will be one of the featured speakers later in the series. So we appreciate all of that. So with all of that said, it's my pleasure now to turn things over, Dr. Craig, to you to provide an overview, a preview of some of the speakers that will be coming up in this series. And we have this little saying in this group that all roads eventually lead to Dr. Craig. So Dr. Craig, take it over.
I don't know why we say that, but it's nice to hear that. So I'm going to talk about some of the next two, the schedule coming up. But before I say that, I do want to say that I think it's very fitting that we start these talks today, because this is the 1 year mark since Ahmaud Arbery was killed. And if you follow the news, you know that we're dealing with another case in California right now, Kurt Andres Reinhold, who was killed by the police for supposedly jaywalking. And we're hearing the release of some videos, some recordings that are kind of putting that notion even in dispute. So I think it's fitting that we started now, and I couldn't let the evening go by without marking those two significant moments that we're living in now. And I think it's exceptionally important that Dr. Jordan's going to be looking at infrastructures of suffering this evening. And as we move on through the projects, you'll see that as we deal with this notion of empathy, leading up to Dr. Rocco's and my talk, I think everything's fitting. I think we're at a moment where empathy needs to be understood a bit more. We need to be thinking about it and talking about it, and really looking at why it can work, how it can work, and maybe possibilities of it not working, but how we can kind of offer a corrective for that as well. So I'm going to share my screen, and hold on 1 second here, and just talk a little bit about the, two of the other projects coming up. So next week, on next Tuesday, on March 2nd at 7 to 8:30, we'll be hearing from Dr. Leandra Paris from the School of Education, William & Mary, and her talk will be A Tale of Two Tigers, using trauma-informed care to promote empathy. And the following week will be Dr. Vanessa Hintz, who is in behavioral and social sciences at Alverno College. And her talk will be, Is This Your King? The Role of Empathy in Understanding Cultural Identity Development. And at the end, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the other talks coming up. But so we can be able to hear from Dr. Scott Jordan, I want to introduce him to you. You've heard him speak already, and we're very excited about his talk. So J. Scott Jordan, PhD, is a cognitive psychologist who studies the neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy of cooperative behavior. He has published over 100 journal articles, book chapters, and encyclopedic entries, as well as 4 edited books and 6 special issues of peer-reviewed journals. He is an Alexander von Humboldt Fellow and has held fellowships at the University of Ulm in Ulm, Germany, the Max Planck Institute for Psychological Research in Munich, Germany, and the Center for Interdisciplinary Research at the University of Bielefeld in Bielefeld, Germany. He has given over 60 invited talks at universities and institutions all over the world, and is currently serving as the chair of the Department of Psychology at Illinois State University. Finally, he is extremely proud of his international comic book collection. It's really a joy to be a part of his world and to understand the whole comic and get involved in the whole comic book world that he's graciously shared with me. And I've actually got into and met him. I do want to say one other real quick thing about Dr. Jordan. When I first started here a couple of years ago at the president's reception, he probably come up and introduce himself. And you know, there were very few Black people in the room. And I always appreciate that he took the time out to come and speak to me, and he's drawn me into his world. And it's a big world with a lot of opportunities in it. So I'm very, very happy to know you, Dr. Jordan, and to be a world of yours. So I just wanted to say all of that. Now, I'll let you, after I've given you such a gracious introduction.
You're so kind, and I have to make sure I don't cry at the beginning of my talk. What I need to take just a moment to get my mouse working a little better than it is right now. So give me just a second. Oh, there we go. Okay. So I'm going to start off tonight by just talking a little bit about what is empathy, show you some definitions from psychology, and show you why I think this leads to a paradoxical take on what empathy is. Then what I'm going to do is show you what some contemporary neuroscience and social psychology that I think gives us a different approach to what we traditionally call empathy, de-individualizes it, and actually takes it into the world we create with the lives that we live. So if there's a take-home message from my talk, is that it's put your empathy in your infrastructure. All right. So with that said, let me go ahead and share my screen here. So what is empathy? Well, according to Hodges and Myers in the Encyclopedia of Social Psychology, empathy is often defined as understanding another person's experience by imagining oneself in that other person's situation. One understands the other person's experience as if it were being experienced by the self, but without the self actually experiencing it. A distinction is still maintained between the self and the other. This is the pretty detailed, long-winded type of definition you'll find in a psychology paper or a textbook. A little more cut to the chase, it's the ability to understand another person's thoughts and feelings in a situation from their point of view. Psychology Today 2015 takes the concept of empathy and puts it on a continuum of engagement. So pity means I acknowledge your suffering. Sympathy means I care about your suffering. Empathy means I feel your suffering. And compassion means I want to relieve your suffering. So here's the thing. When we listen to these definitions of empathy, they're pretty consistent with how we tend to use the concept in daily life. And I would also argue it's pretty consistent with how we think about empathy in the individualist culture that we live in. The idea is that empathy is something an individual extends to another individual. As I said, I think this is a paradoxical approach, or maybe an incoherent approach to empathy. And I'm just going to give you a little story. So 5 guys, they've gotten together. They're at a big event. There are a lot of people there, a lot of motion. And one of the guys falls down. So 2 of the guys turn around, they stop, they turn around, they pick him up, Then they all run up the stairs, pick up a flagpole, and beat a policeman over the head. Now, when I started this example, my use of the concept empathy describing the 5 gentlemen with the 1 falling and the 2 helping was consistent with how we use the term. But then when we see that this empathy is being used to keep a group together that one might not believe is very empathetic, we come to really get stuck on what empathy means. And we really get stuck on how it could ever help us move forward, right? So when we find ourselves doing things like, oh, okay, it was good empathy that moment and now it's bad and now it's good, we have to ask ourselves a question. And that is empathy really good or bad? Or is empathy really something that we manage? And what I want to talk to you today is propose today is a managerial approach to empathy and managing who we will give access to our empathy. Whose suffering will we take on and whose suffering will we not take on? Now, before we go any further, let's just get real, put some live life on the table here. I'm not going to ask you to speak out loud, but I am going to ask you some questions. And what I want to do is I want you to pay attention to your immediate emotional response when I ask you this question. And then when I say why, I want you to pay attention to the story you tell yourself about what your emotion was. So here we go. Do you know someone you would let into your apartment, dorm, or home? Why? Do you know someone you would not let into your home, dorm, or apartment? Why? Have you ever been in a situation in which you felt everyone present truly understood who you were? Why? Have you ever been in a situation in which you felt people were so different they wouldn't understand who you are? Why? What do you think it would feel like to be in a situation in which you believe no one understands what it's like to be you? My point is, as I gave you these questions, I suspect some of you had emotional responses and were generating words to help you manage things like your trust of others, your vulnerability to others, your happiness around others, your sadness around others. My point here, let me switch my page here. These are some of the feelings you may have experienced. One final question. How many of you have called or texted a friend in the last month because somebody made you mad? Why? All of these questions are to draw our attention to the emotional responses we have, the different types of emotional responses we have to interactions with different people, right? And what we do to try to manage those emotional responses. So how do we manage our trust, our vulnerability, our happiness, and our sadness? How do we decide who to let in and who to keep out? Do we even do it consciously? What I'm going to propose is that while empathy does exist and does bring people closer, many of us don't have to actually decide from moment to moment who will receive our empathy and who will not. Because we live in worlds, we live in infrastructures that keep certain people out without any empathy work on our part at all. In other words, the very life I live, my values, my desires, my goals give rise to and sustain neighborhoods, towns, cities, and countries that allow some people in my presence while simultaneously keeping others out. In short, our lives give rise to and sustain infrastructures of suffering. And that's my point here. So how do we go about creating these infrastructures of suffering. I'm going to argue that generating an infrastructure of suffering has everything to do with empathy. But first, I want to talk about some recent science regarding the nature of empathy that asks the question, is empathy something we have to work hard to activate? Or do we actually spend more energy ensuring we don't have to activate it? All right, so what I'm going to do now is share my screen, jump into some of the neuroscience of empathy, and I'll come back out here after I've been through all of those slides. So, how do we manage our empathy? And I'm going to say we manage our empathy the same way we balance our bodies. So this is your cortex. And then underneath the cortex is a brain structure known as the cerebellum. There are 5 times more neurons in that little cerebellum than there are in the whole cortex. I'm going to be referring to the cerebellum as a neural recorder. All right. So when your motor cortex sends out a command through your spinal cord to your body, telling you to move your body in a particular way, what I've traced out here is that the neural activity goes from your motor cortex down into your spinal cord. It makes your body move, and then that white line coming back refers to feedback generated by the movement. Now that time cycle there is 120 milliseconds. So from the time you issue a command to move your finger, to move your legs, it's about 1/10 of a second before feedback actually gets back to your brain. Now that's much too slow for us to be able to do things like watch Jimi Hendrix play 24 notes a second on a guitar. So somehow humans are able to control their balance and their bodies at time scales that are much faster than the feedback we get from the environment. Now you might think, who cares? Well, the answer is the whole bailiwick, because what it turns out is that most of the stuff we do, most of the behaving we do, most of the thinking we do, most of the communicating we do is being driven by memory of how we did it before. And what I'm going to argue is that all of us live in worlds of memory of how we've managed ourselves in the past. Now, here's the neural architecture of how that happens. So your motor cortex is sitting there doing its job. It's sending out commands. But what also happens is that neural activity from your motor cortex also descends down to the cerebellum, what we'll call the neural recorder. Some people like to call this a command of the copy from the cortex. So that command gets stored, if you like, down in the cerebellum. That white line coming down to the cerebellum from the environment, what that means is that those brain cells in the cerebellum, they are influenced by both the command of what should have happened and the feedback of what actually happened. Now, why does this matter? Because every time you do something with your brain in the cortex, it gets recorded in relation to what happened after you did it. You can call them command feedback memories if you like. Now, here's why this completely matters. Because those neurons, those tape recording neurons, those memory neurons, if you like, they actually influence what goes on in the motor cortex neurons that influence them in the first place. Now, this loop here between the cortex and the cerebellum, this takes 10 milliseconds. What this means is that when Jimi Hendrix is starting to play a guitar solo, his motor cortex might be planning the first 2 movements. But once that movement command gets to his memory, to his cerebellum, to his neural recorder, that signal actually primes the next movements that should happen before feedback arrives from the environment. Therefore, Jimi Hendrix is basically playing his guitar on memory. Expert athletes are controlling their bodies on memory. As I sit here and speak to you now, I have no idea how my brain is producing the words I just said. All I know is I want to say words. And because of the memories I have of how I've said words in the past, basically I'm forming all of this from memory. Why does this matter? Some people talk to this memory signal that's sent up to the rest of the cortex. They call it anticipatory motor error. They call it virtual feedback. They call it dynamic state estimation. Those three words there are important: anticipatory, virtual, and estimation. And they are important because the concepts anticipatory, virtual, and estimate all refer to balance management. They all refer to the future of your foot or the future of your body. They are derived from what your feet have done in the past. They are being generated all the time, and you don't notice until you're walking down the stairs with your friend, talking about that latest episode of Snowpiercer, when suddenly you start to fall because you unconsciously assumed you had reached the last stair, but there was still one to go. Anybody in house ever had that happen? I have that happen often. The point is, up until that moment, your feet were being controlled by memory. And as long as the actual feedback didn't contradict the predicted memorized feedback, you were fine. But once there was a strong mismatch between what you unconsciously anticipated would happen and what actually happened, then you become massively conscious of your feet and you do everything you can not to fall. So the point is here, we live on autopilot from our memories, and we only notice that we're generating those memories when we're surprised. Therefore, we manage our balance. When we manage our balance, the past primes the present as an anticipation about the future. And the thing to remember is this is going on all the time. Okay, so it gets even creepier, right? How is managing empathy like managing balance? Well, it turns out that this architecture of the cortex basically being recorded in the cerebellum exists for the entire cortex. We used to think that it was just the motor cortex and the cerebellum was just involved in keeping the body balanced quickly. But it turns out that, in fact, when you're thinking, your next thought is being driven by what you thought in the past. When you're speaking, the production of those words is being driven by how you've done that in the past. So when we go to the dentist and we get our mouth numbed and we start biting ourselves when we talk, it's because the memories don't work with the way our body's set up now, because basically the sensory nerves have been dulled. Whoop. This means that every emotion, every action, every perception, and every thought that you have is primed by memories of past emotions, past actions, past perceptions, and past thoughts. In emotion, action, perception, and cognition, the past is always unconsciously and continuously fed forward into the present as a prediction about the future. So, okay, this is a lot of words. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to give you a very high-tech demonstration of exactly what I said. I need all of you to pay attention to me right now. Okay, so every one of you knows exactly what word I'm going to say. Now, how many of you had the word now or next come into your mind? Don't be shy, okay? Okay, so you predicted, the way we would talk about that is you predicted my next word. But how many of you knew that the pitch of my voice was going to bottom out? And how do we know to take turns in a conversation? We know unconsciously that it's approaching my time to speak when the other person finally decides to stop talking and their voice bottoms out. Next time you're in a conversation with more than two people, pay attention to those moments when the voice is bottoming out. See how much people fight over getting in the next person to speak, getting in as the next person to speak, and then notice the fights that happen when some people don't want to give up. And what will happen eventually is people will keep talking over each other, probably for no more than a second, and then eventually someone will back off, or you just have a big fight. Now, these things that you experienced when you heard my voice, we don't even know we're experiencing them, right? And we don't know we're experiencing them because they're memories driven by how we've been in conversations before, right? Now, on the one hand, it's like, oh my God, I mean, we're doing all this stuff and we're not consciously in control of it. And I would say this commitment to us being individuals consciously in control of what we do is an artifact of Western individualism that I don't think many other cultures suffer from. And we'll talk about in a moment why it's actually psychologically necessary that we float on memory. All right, so let me Catch myself up here. All right. Oh, let's just go back. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a sec. I'll start sharing my screen again. So we live in multiple scales of unconscious, what I'll call storytelling, unconscious memory management, simultaneously all the time. And we never notice it unless we're surprised. So here's just a dude walking down the street trying to get everybody to believe that he's not ignoring that homeless man. So what's this guy doing? Well, he's telling him memories about how he's moved his body before. How do we know that? Well, if he hits a point on the sidewalk where a brick actually has been lifted up, we'll see him trip because he's controlling his legs on memory. He has memories about how his body relates to the rest of the world. For example, in this case, how far should I stay away from that guy? Right? He's also living in a memory, hey, is this the right way to get to the grocery store? Right? Here's another memory he's living in. Man, the infrastructure of this town has gone to crap since the 80s, right? My point is he's living in all of those unconscious memories simultaneously. Because he's managing memories developed spontaneously out of our lived life, they feel like norms. Because we don't feel that can't feel that we're generating them, they just feel right. And when things don't work out that way, we feel something is wrong. And you can learn something quickly from a person if their unconscious assumptions are violated and they actually blame it on the world, or maybe they use it as a moment of growth to ask themselves, why was I ever assuming that in the first place? Now, these memories of how you've moved your body, your emotions, your perceptions, and your ideas over the course of your life, and you live in them constantly. How does society influence our management memories? This is probably my favorite study that I've seen in the past 5 years. So you have a papa finch there, and you have a son finch. And what's happening is the papa finch is teaching the son finch, the finch song. And what happens in the baby's brain is the baby hears the song with the same part of its brain it would use to plan its own singing. Let me say that once again. The baby hears the song with similar parts of the brain it would use to plan its own singing. What that means is the father's song is actually taking over the planning structures of the baby's brain. So dad sings, baby sings along, all seems good, baby starts to learn the song. What's really, really cool here, however, is after a point, the baby's brain starts to inhibit the influence that dad has on it. In other words, once a bit of a song has been learned, the brain then keeps the father out. Now we ask ourselves, well, anybody who's been a parent has seen this happen all the time, right? We ask ourselves, why would the brain ever keep someone out? And the reason is so that this finch can become its own finch. So the irony here is that the finch has to have its brain controlled via remote control by a context, be it a parent, caregiver, family member, whatever. And at some point, the very brain itself is going to start reorganizing itself in ways that keep the influence of those others out. I told you the bit about the finch hearing the father, parts of its brain that it would use to plan its own chirps. This is turning out to be a fundamental design principle of the brain across species. In other words, it turns out that when you see another person act, what's happening to your brain is that you're being put in the planning state to do the very same thing. This is why your mom told you don't hang around with that kid, he's a bad influence. Because she knew that what you saw that person do, you would be primed to do the very same thing. And it turns out that's how we see each other. The traditional model is what happens is, I build a picture of you in my head of what you're doing, and then I infer what you're doing and what your goals are. It turns out that, in fact, this area F5 here, which is the prefrontal cortex, this is involved in you planning your own object-related actions like picking up a ball. Just picking up a ball works. And it turns out that when you watch someone else pick up a ball, what that means is that your brain is put in the planning state for picking up a ball. It turns out that the kinematics of movement are also what we call mirrored. So when you move your hands in particular ways, When you watch me move my hand in a particular way, what it means for you to see that is that you're actually put in the planning state for producing those movements yourself. Some people then call this resonance. In other words, instead of having to look at each other and build pictures about what the other's doing and then generate an inference, which we might call a theory of mind, it turns out to be the case that in fact, humans are very sensitive to the movements, the goals, and the thoughts of other humans because we experience them with our own planning states. It's almost as if when we're interacting with each other, what it means to interact with another is to actually let them in and have influence on your planning states, okay? Given this, this idea of reciprocal influence of planning states, Rizalotti et al. Like to refer to this as resonance, and that's the model I'm going to try to use here. Low-level resonance means doing the same movement that someone else is doing. High-level resonance means doing the same goals. So here's an example we've all seen. Birds on a beach, one starts to flap. We all think this looks cool, but really what's going on, it's actually cooler than that. The dynamics of one bird's flapping wings are actually priming the wing flapping planning of all the other birds. So they're actually coupling their planning states with each other simply by being around each other. Humans do this with thought and actions. I'm just going to skip this example and move on. Now, on one hand, it seems weird that we float on memory. It seems weird that we resonate with each other in this way. So why is it that we generate these memories? We have to generate these memories so we can distinguish our bodies, our perceptions, and our thoughts and emotions from those of others. So for example, you got the Finch song I told you about. Data indicate that persons diagnosed as schizophrenic are actually better able to tickle themselves than people not diagnosed as schizophrenic. Now, why? Further data indicate that when I go to tickle my wrist, what I actually do to my own brain is dampen my sensitivity to my wrist, right? In other words, by planning to do something to my body, I dampen my body's sensitivity to that activity, which lets me then discriminate and distinguish what I'm doing from what the world is doing. People diagnosed with schizophrenia also experience occasional delusions and hallucinations. Data indicate that what's going on is they're having thoughts, for example, but they're not keeping track of the fact that they're creating these thoughts themselves. Now, just to give you an idea of what that might be like, and to let us all understand that we're all doing that every moment of every day, every one of you has at least two thoughts in your head right now. One is, man, this is pretty cool stuff this guy's saying. And the other is the stuff that I'm saying. You can tell those two apart in your own brain because what you're doing is being run by your planning memories. And it allows you to parse out, to structure your brain in ways so that you can distinguish what you've done from what either someone else or the world has done. This is the fundamental psychological work of the brain, because what it does is afford us self-otherness. We don't like to talk about self-otherness in good ways. What these data indicate is that othering, distinguishing self from other, is a design principle of how brains work. Now I'm saying all of this so I can get to a point to talk about what empathy might be that'll sound different than the way we talk about it. We tend to talk about it. And I'm gonna, again, these management memories that emerge out of our life spontaneously, we generate all the time, and they create these necessary barriers. Now, we don't like to talk about empathy and barriers because we think empathy is supposed to overcome barriers. And I understand that completely. At the same time, if we don't have othering being generated by the brain, we can't be someone. So the issue of whether or not it's good to other transforms into, maybe as a culture, what we need to do is train people to generate different types of othering, because that's what the brain does. So we have to train developing humans, i.e. kids, and the rest of us, to be honest, how to manage the otherings that our brain is unconsciously generating because of the life that we've lived, consciously put those needed changes in the world so that over time they can become memories. That's the conscious work to do. Change the consequences of how you're in the world and change them consistently so that over time they become memories of how you've been in the world. Okay. Now, let's look at how these management memories develop. So when you have an infant, then you have a caregiver, data indicate that interactional synchrony between the caregiver and the infant is highly correlated with later attachment. What that means is when a caregiver goes boo and the baby goes boo back, that idea of seeing each other in terms of plans, what's happening, I as a parent am putting a plan in this infant's brain to go, ooh. Now the kid can't do all the cool stuff with its face that I can because I'm older and more experienced. So the kid might blink an eye, right? The point is there is this reciprocal chain of influence that gets set up intentionally by caregivers leads to a sense of attachment that plays out for the rest of the life. And as I just said, it doesn't even have to be synchrony between the same movements. It's almost as if one system is putting a pattern of wave into another, which is evoking a wave pattern. And because what do? We go, boo. What does a kid do? Boo. And what does that get out of us? Oh, boo. And we just get this thing back and forth that's so terribly fun. We don't even have to think about what we're doing. But what we don't understand that we're doing, we're not teaching the kid anything about information. What we're teaching the kid is about emotions. We're teaching the kid how to be persistently in a space that's positive. And what this does is lead to trust. Not conscious trust, not narratives about trust, but an embodiment of memory of positive outcomes. So what this means is that as a kid moves through life, people that generate negative consequences for that kid are simply going to be avoided. And people that generate positive consequences for that kid are going to be approached. No one has to even think about it, all right? It's just how it ends up playing out. Social avoidance denies the other access to your resonance systems. Developing management memories affords the management of social relationships. If all of you agree that there are people you would not let in your home, this is what you're doing. You are managing your vulnerability because we know that when we look at someone who's suffering and we look at it, we're going to be put in a state of suffering. So what we do is we manage that. Who to let in and who to keep out. Given this model, this resonance model of what empathy might be, I think we can start to think of the self not as this individualized central computer thing that takes inputs from the world, runs a bunch of algorithms on what should happen and generates output. But rather, I think we can look at the self as the management of others, i.e. the self as a multi-scale pattern of memories of others. Our sense of being an independent agent emerges developmentally out of our persistent interactions with others. Our sense of self, our own system of management memories, emerges contextually and contingently, out of approach-avoid dynamics. Part of who we are, and this is the important part, inescapably part of who we are is the others we keep out. The self is a system of management memories about embodied others. So what I want to do at this point, let me just stop sharing my screen here. There we go. All right, so I'm back with you guys now. I had to go into data land and slides to show you all that. From this notion of multi-scale management, empathy is not as simple as good, bad. As a matter of fact, empathy keeps hate groups together. That's something we just can't forget. Hate groups aren't together because they hate each other, right? What they're doing is using their empathy to form a group that ends up getting defined by its hate for others. So empathy is a dangerous drug, right? And it's something that we need to have, I would argue, a grounded, resource-driven approach to understanding. So given that our own individual system of management memories emerges contextually and contingency out of our lived lives, where we live those lives matters. And this is how I get to the idea of infrastructures of suffering. In the 2011 book, How Race Takes Place, written by Professor George Lipsitz, professor in the Department of Black Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, he says the following, and I'm just going to read this stuff verbatim because there's no reason to paraphrase. It's just so clear. And now I'm struggling to read. Let me change my glasses for a second. For example, at least 46 million, let me say that number again, 46 million white adults today can trace the origins of their family wealth to the Homestead Act of 1862. The bill gave away valuable acres of land for free to white families. I got to work the light here, but expressly precluded participation by blacks. 70 years later, the 1934 Federal Housing Act distributed federally insured home mortgages to whites in overly and directly discriminatory fashion, building additional equity in the estates of some 35 million white families between 1934 and 1978. While systematically excluding black families from those opportunities. Moreover, because money is passed down across generations through inheritance, the patterns of the past still shape opportunities in the present. Whites not only inherit the riches of the flow across generations because of these policies, but new provisions in the tax code consistently add more forms of favored treatment to inherited wealth while increasing taxes on earned income. Sorry, I didn't read that as well as I like. I've got my light set a little differently. So I could go read some more passages by Dr. Lipsitz, but I think I'll just bring my talk to a conclusion here and I'll say what I like to add to his profound words is the management memories learned and the lived lives of the privileged are expressly created to turn adherence to these discriminatory policies into virtue. Phrases like, I moved into this neighborhood for my kids. What's going on there? That is an implicit awareness of the discrimination being created by these neighborhoods. But instead of addressing the dissonance head on, that dissonance is turned into a virtue. I'm doing this for my kids, as we, by the way, just recently saw in the last week, as you all saw, and I won't go into the details. All lives matter. What's the point of that phrase? The point of that phrase is to turn the dissonance generated by Black Lives Matter into virtue for me. No. All lives matter. I'm virtuous. What are you doing? Why are you discriminating? People who live in poverty simply haven't tried hard enough. Right? All of these types of phrases are implicit understandings of all of these rhetorics reflect an implicit awareness of cultural inequity and serve to keep out the suffering of those discriminated against while simultaneously granting virtue to the act of ignoring. That's if I'm going to use the word sickness, the actual word itself is acknowledgement that you're ignoring. Of course, our clothes, our car, our job, and our community all collectively do much of this ignoring for us. And if we want to truly move toward the creation and sustainment of a more diverse, inclusive, and equitable culture, we will have to consciously address how the infrastructures of suffering created by the collectively lived lives of the privileged have limited and constrained the lives of others. And for this to work, we have to want it. Why do we have to want it? Because we know how vulnerable we are to turning dissonance into virtue. The brain will avoid pain and turn our dissonance into virtue without us even knowing that that's happened. So if we want this to happen, if this is going to happen, it has to happen because we want it and we committed ourselves to it consciously. So thank you very much for listening to me. And I'm glad to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Scott. And we already have 2 questions in the chat, and I'll actually go ahead and just read them. And
Please
I'll
do.
start with the first one from Ricia, asking, regarding the idea that every emotion is primed by memories of past perceptions, can you talk about what that means for memories that are not directly experienced, but more obviously mediated, like racist media content, for example?
Oh my God.
Do those types of images and narratives work in the same way that personal memories work in terms of priming us to see and interpret things in particular ways?
Yes. And because this culture has turned its moral agenda over to private industry, we witnessed the boss trying to sell us a Jeep during the Super Bowl, taking a white man's hand, putting it through the dirt in the supposed middle of the country, asking everyone to come together. Let's think about that for a second. Who's being invited to what middle? Who's being invited? I don't think Indigenous Americans feel invited. I don't think Black Americans feel invited. I don't think Latino Americans feel invited. So let's look at who's invited. If it's white people inviting each other and they're the ones that need to come together, that means things that I find very terrifying. So all the time, and that's precisely why commercials are made. That's precisely why so much time and energy is generated to create these visual rhetorics that are meant to include and exclude. But then that's how I've experienced the commercial world for a long time. That's why my kids won't watch TV with me, because all I do is rail at commercials and make sure I record things so I don't have to sit through it. I find it so much less than we can be. And I find it to be another example of the privatization of our culture, which is, it's leading to us losing our moral edge, our moral will. And I'll stop there. Thank you for that fantastic question. I was going to make a slide with a whole bunch of pictures from the Boss commercial and just didn't get to it. So that question just let me talk about it. It's great.
All right, here's the second question from our chat, from Eros, asking, evolutionarily speaking, has evolution predisposed humans to show more empathy toward in-group members, us, than out-group members, them? In other words, are we predisposed to show prejudice? In other words, distrust or avoidance toward out-group members to protect in-group members?
So I'm going to answer first off, yes, and then I'm going to say no. So the answer is yes, but I don't like to use the word disposed. The infrastructures of suffering that we have created are an artifact of the lives we've lived. They're not a plan. They're not evolution. It's worlds that we have created with the desire to live a certain way. And because we're so capable of converting dissonance into virtue on the fly, we never even consciously experience that we're ignoring others, let alone ignoring their suffering. So the data do indicate, for example, that brains do different things when you watch the pain of someone in your in-group versus someone in your out-group. So if you watch someone in your in-group experiencing pain, you get activity in the emotional centers of the brain. But if you watch someone in pain who's in the out-group, you don't get that kind of activity. Now, is that disposition? I would argue, no, that's culture. You have specifically been trained to have this type of emotional response to this type of person. So disposed, I would argue, I just worry about that term because it takes away our ability to change. It's all something we created, right? With a hell of a lot of work. So yeah, that was another fantastic question. Thank you so much.
There's a quick follow-up to that question too. Perfect. That asks, but hasn't evolution predisposed humans to create cultures?
Oh, this is a fantastic question. So depends on what you think people are. And I hate to sound like that, but if you think what people are computers that generate programs and have biological systems that run like machines, then you can say things like evolution programmed the machine to create cultures and stuff. What I like to do is this. when you look at ants, right, and how ants get organized, ants are incredibly organized, and ants don't think about being organized. The reason ants are organized is because they dissipate and detect pheromone, by the way, which we do all the time, we just don't talk about. So you get ants and they radiate from the nest in a 360 degrees heading out in the morning. Why are they going 360? Is that a plan? No, it's just that they all can't go out the same way, right? So they all get dispersed because of an artifact of the arrangement in the environment. They go out, and as they're going out, they lay down pheromone. Now that matters because when they detect food, it changes the pheromone, they dissipate. And they follow the gradient back to the nest from before, but they also recreate a new gradient. Now, we just talk about that as chemical signals, and I think that's when we drop the ball. What these organisms are doing is creating the context in which they're going to live. Being, B-E-I-N-G, is the creation of the context. And what we've done is put so much of our being into our minds that it's allowed us to distract ourselves from how much of our being is actually creating a world. And so I like to think of human thoughts, humans get-togethers as pheromone gradients. And what are we doing in the world to keep ourselves together, right? Birds generate auditory gradients when they're looking for a mate. And generating the things we call culture is, I would argue that's ant culture. And I would argue that's bird culture. And what differentiates us is the degrees of freedom that we can bring to the world to change it. And the way we tend to change the world tends to be much more future oriented, to the point where we even stress out for our entire life about when we're going to die. Think about that. You know, birds don't do that, right? So this big bad brain we have that's supposed to be such a selective advantage is precisely why we're so anxious, because we can actually psychologically live in these potentially stressful futures. So yes, disposed to create culture, we wouldn't be here if we couldn't change the context in which we sustain ourselves. And that's what a lot of people tend to call making a culture. Fantastic question. Thank you so much.
And I guess to tie into what you just mentioned with animals and kind of the idea of even like insect cultures, we get a really good question from Jen here asking, is part of the cultural effect due to dehumanization, the dark side of anthropomorphism?
Yeah, so some of the papers I read preparing for this thing did some research on empathy in high school kids, or excuse me, college kids over 20, 30 years. And the data indicate that they are less empathic, right? And I didn't read the whole paper, so I don't know if they have the data to prove it. But the reason they're giving is because of the advent of social media and the rise of the self-perpetuating world. That I create an identity for myself out there, and that's my work. Instead of God, when I was growing up, if I wanted to be around other people, I had to put my clothes on, right? I had to go out into the street and meet my friends. I couldn't sit somewhere and click on buttons. And so the argument is they do have the data on these empathy scales they take. It does seem to be the case that there is a decrease in empathy culturally. And because of the advent of social media, which I love the Google machine. I love being able to hang around with people I like and talk about stuff, but so do people who hate people, right? So in other words, what social media has done is democratized information. It has democratized your desires to the point where you can find people who share the same desires in ways you couldn't 30 years ago. And so it's amplified good. It has amplified bad. And I think in the terms of dehumanization, as we've experienced for the past 4 or 5 years, it's actually now, it was sanctioned at the federal level, which that was the last straw, right? Then there were no cultural inhibitions left. So yeah, I do. So the thing is this, I think dehumanization is on the rise, but I also think humanization is on the rise. And I'm on team humanization, and all we can do is try to put more of what we want out of the world into the world. I occasionally go to high schools to talk to students that are on things called culture councils. These are students that are selected by the administration to get some training and then provide workshops for their peers on diversity, inclusion, and equity. And when I was talking with these young people, this young man said, well, what do I do when I can't persuade anyone? They won't listen to me. And I said, well, that's not your job. Your job isn't to change individual minds. What your job is to be in the world as a persistent witness of that value so that they see it every day and they know eventually if they want to come there, they can. I think we put way too much pressure on ourselves, way too much pressure on activists to actually change individual minds. I argue change the world and some minds will follow. And waiting on individuals to be persuaded is not the step forward I think a lot of people think it is. So thank you for that awesome question.
All right. I'm not seeing any others show up in the chat, but I do want to take a moment if there are any that are difficult to type, or if anyone would like to respond to anything that they've heard tonight here in the Zoom room, feel free to raise your hand and we can join you in the conversation here. And yep, there's Ricia. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you here.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I was just wondering if you wanted to say anything about this, the question. It's a bit of a different kind of question, but the question of the kind of, and maybe you answered it a little bit in the answer you just gave to the previous question, but the types of empathy we should extend to racists, you know what I mean? Or the types of empathy, the maybe not to racists, but you know, there's been debates on the left about how reclaimable, you know, the sort of white working class that voted for Trump is or isn't, and is it worth time, and who should be doing that work? And I just wanted to know if you had anything to say.
No, that's another fantastic question. I truly appreciate you asking that. And our very own interim dean, Diane Zosky, is going to be giving a talk later on in the series about how you actually go about giving empathy to people that you don't respect. And so look, I ended my talk with this idea of what do we want? And one strategy is to actually encounter racists and try to change them. Another strategy is just to put the world I want into motion with the people I meet and do that work and increase the amplitude of that signal, make that the cool town square to be at, and they'll decide what they're going to do. I think we put way too much pressure on ourselves to change them. So I don't like to use the word what we should do with them, because I'm going to leave that up to everybody's individual choice in terms of how they spend their energy. But I get in trouble sometimes for my optimism, right? I am optimistic about the future. I think the energies are in the right space. I think we have a ton of work to do. And I think what I want to do is to find the people that want to do that work and get it out there, make it a persistent aspect of the culture we live in, so that eventually people have to say, I don't want to do that. And when they say, I don't want to do that, we keep moving. Now, let's also make it clear, people that trespass in the Capitol should be held accountable. So you can have all the empathy you want, but when you broke the law like that, laws are about empathy as well. In other words, laws are social contracts as to what we're not going to let people do to harm others. Why? Because we have empathy for others. We have empathy for the people that were in the Capitol. We have empathy for the policemen who were trying to protect the people in the Capitol. So when you break those social contracts, I have no problem. I'm not going to say you should. I'm going to say I have no problem. And I prefer if these people are held accountable. That kind of accountability has to happen right now. The world needs to see that everybody is treated the same under the law. So I hope that was in any way an answer. For me, it's just keep doing work. And yeah, I hope that's not too pie in the sky.
Right. Anyone else?
Hey, I can't figure out how to put the hand up. I want to follow up on that question real quick. Sorry.
Alrighty.
Does someone have their hand up before I start? And my apologies for earlier, my internet went out. So if I got cut off when I was doing my introduction, I apologize for that. But so Scott, I wonder, Dr. Jordan, I'm sorry, if you could.
Scott works.
I want to kind of go back to the way you just answered that question, but I want you to, can you elaborate a little bit on that by talking about how the patterns of the past inform the present also, right? When we think about structures of racism, right, or systemic racism, and racists themselves, because something I'm grappling with right now, I was watching a program the other day and I got really, really angry because I'm hearing this narrative that's sort of reminding me of the narrative of opioid addiction and the crack addiction, right? And so this new narrative is about, well, you know, we have to work with these people and, you know, we can save them and all this, right? And it really infuriates me. It makes me really angry because I'm like, well, see, here we go again. You know, we want to save certain groups of people, but not the other groups of people, right? And so I wonder how this speaks to this notion of patterns of the past informing the present. If you could just maybe talk about that a little bit.
I love your question, and I'm going to say dissonance to virtue, right? There are people, one of the things about empathy is that a lot of people like to focus on empathy as good. And when it comes to holding people accountable for breaking the law or things that they've done, we don't like the negative affect it generates. We don't like doing things to people that harm them. So we feel bad if we have to be on the jury. We feel bad because what we're doing is causing another harm. And so I think what happens is, instead of being someone who says, no, they all need to go to jail, dissonance gets turned to virtue again, and they say, oh, they can be saved. And not being aware of that move. Why do they need to be saved? What about all the black men in prisons, right? Who needs to be saved and why? Instead of examining what's being kept the same, because that dissonance is turned to virtue, it just keeps happening. And until we put, you know, I almost started my talk with this. I just didn't, but any of you have ever played euchre, pinochle, bridge, spades, you know that the card you put on the table tells the world just as much about the cards you have in your hand. And that's the game, is try to manage what people think about the cards you have in your hand. We're doing this poker game and we're not showing each other the cards in our hand. And the data I read you from Dr. Lipsett's book is showing you what people have in their hand, right? It's showing you what's being kept the same while people are saying things like all lives matter. I did it for my kids, all these things. So we don't have to do anything, first of all. What I want us to do is to start having a conversation about what we have in our hands, and put some of those cards on the table so that we can talk about who should go to jail, who shouldn't. We can talk about things like reparations and not lose our minds, right? There are things that we need to, I'm using that word need again. There are things I want us to work toward. And if we keep holding our cards and not talking about what's staying the same, we're just going to have the same old dissonance to virtue stuff. So yeah, you're absolutely right, and I can completely understand why you had that reaction. Yeah.
Great. anyone have a hand up? I want to pick your brain about one other thing. I like to go back to the I want to go back to the Jeep commercial with you for a second. Right? So I wonder. I'm trying to articulate this in a way. So of course, now Obama and Bruce Springsteen have their Renegade podcast, right?
Yeah.
So I wonder, this going back to this whole notion to this middle of the road kind of thing that Jeep. Well, again, we've talked about the whole, corporatization of this and, the commercials and the ads. So we really know what that's about also. But
right.
I wonder then if we're thinking about this notion of dissonance and, how all this is, outside of my knowledge base. But, thinking about this ad and what it seemingly tried to do,
Yep.
right? Do you think that it works anywhere within, the talk that you just gave? Does it do anything? Do you see it doing anything positive? In thinking about that along the lines of empathy and thinking about empathy in the way you just talked about it,
Yeah.
right? Is there anything productive about that?
Well, it shows us what cards aren't being played, right? I mean, it's productive in the sense that they put those cards on the table, and if we're looking closely, we can see what they're actually holding. We can see what the proposed virtue is hiding. So I'm productive. I mean, here's the way I try to stay away from what we should do. I'm trying to stay from what's right. And I try to look at what do you want to manage? How do you want things to be? And when I see that commercial, I don't want to see that without a conversation. I got so mad in the middle of the Super Bowl. My wife can't watch the Super Bowl with me anymore. I just can't watch these things. When we capitulate so much of our moral authority to the private industry, quite a bit about where we are right now has everything to do with a lack of public will on what's moral. And capitulating to private industry to teach us that through commercials and ads and Facebook hits and that kind of stuff leaves us vulnerable to our worst side. So is there anything positive? I guess if it gets somebody to come together to talk about it so I can tell them what I think they really saw, then it's positive. But what I get concerned about is when you turn it into virtue, it's like sucking your thumb, right? It's just anxiety reduction. And then you just go mentally numb, right? And that's the point. You go numb and you want a Jeep and you don't know why you're buying a Jeep. What's so bizarrely ironic is how our government is actually losing out on this game. I mean, why doesn't the NSF have a budget for generating commercials? Why doesn't the IRS have a budget for generating commercials so they compete in meme space and show the virtues of the American IRS, show the virtues of a national healthcare system, and use all the fancy production techniques and manipulate people's emotions? Because we are just getting hammered by experts at manipulating human emotions, doing things that lead to people mentally sucking their thumbs. And again, I suck my thumb all the time when I watch old science fiction and, binge a series. So I'm not saying I never do it. It's just, it's not the way that we can change things. Yeah. Another great question. You guys are awesome.
Well, I'm currently seeing no more questions in either the comments. We don't have any on YouTube at the moment either.
Okay.
But we do have some great feedback saying, great talk and thank you for what you've provided this evening.
No, my pleasure.
And,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say at this point, I should turn it back over to Dr. Craig for a little bit more information about what's coming up.
Cool.
Yeah, Dr. Jordan, thank you it was a great talk, and it's
thank you.
I'm left thinking about a lot of different things here this evening. I'm sure I'll be bothering you later on with text, asking you some more questions. So, and again, everyone, I apologize. I think my internet went out earlier. I live in an old building and my internet's just going in and out right now. So I apologize if I don't know how much of what I was saying was missed. So, so I just want to talk briefly about some more of the upcoming colloquia that we're doing. And let me share my screen here. And just a quick preview again. So if you didn't hear me before, we have two talks, one next Tuesday at same time, 7 to 8:30 with Dr. Leandra Paris, A Tale of Two Tigers Using Trauma-Informed Care to Promote Empathy. And then the following week on March 9th at the same time with Dr. Vanessa Hintz, Behavior and Social Sciences from Alverno College on Is This Your King? The Role of Empathy in Understanding Cultural Identity Development. In the coming weeks after that, I think they go every 2 weeks instead of every week. So these are the 3 that are happening week after week so we can get everything in. After that, we'll have more talks. And I think, well, I'll just name them really quickly. On March, we have one on March 23rd from 7 to 8:30, and then April 13th from 7 to 8:30, and then Dean Zosky is on April 27th. And I'll say hers, Outcomes in Process, since we mentioned it earlier, extending empathy with perpetrators of intimate partner violence. And then Narrative is Empathy Training by Dr. Teresa Rojas, Department of English, Modesto Junior College, Narratives of Empathy Training. And then we conclude the series with myself and Dr. Rocco, who's at the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University, and what should empathy be in this moment of cultural reckoning? And it will conclude our series on the road to Tulsa, where we'll be looking at empathy, what we think empathy should look like in this moment, and tying that into the Tulsa riot massacre, as we call it. So we hope that you can join us for more of these talks. As you saw tonight, I think it was a very informative discussion. And we can continue having this talk about empathy in the year 2021, so we can see exactly where we are, right? And I thought about this talk all day today while I was watching some of the hearings this afternoon and listening to some of the police officers talk. And I was struck, and I think one of the reasons why I'm so interested in this project, you know, when I hear Black police officers talking about being called the N-word as they're trying to protect what is really our government, and then our custodial staff, who are mostly brown and Black people, having to clean up the feces of mobs going in, who can't accept what happened, but, you know, being honest, they're also white extremists. And you know, the whole ideal of people who look like me having to clean up after these people, it makes me question this notion of empathy, and helping, you know, with me trying to find empathy for someone else who does these types of things. So, you know, for me, this is a very productive series, because it's keeping me centered and helping me to have a little bit more hope and humankind. And I won't say mankind, because women were also implicit in what was going on at the Capitol that day. And we know from history that white women were also involved in lynchings and slavery, and played a very big role in that. So these talks give me hope in a time where I really need hope during this moment. So I don't know, unless Dr. Jordan, you have something else to say, or if anyone else has any comments or questions.
I would just like to say that the point of this series is to get us so we can listen to Dr. Craig and Dr. Reiko's talk with different eyes than perhaps we're used to listening to such talks. So we appreciate you joining, and we hope you come next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.